So thank you all. Thanks, Tom. Thank you all for having me. It's a great honor and privilege to be here. It's great to be on the same stage as Ambassador Pyatt. We've known each other for almost 20 years. And I can tell you that you have one of the best diplomats in the U.S. Foreign Service. And it's a credit to Greece that the State Department would, after an incredibly difficult and important posting of having Jeff in Ukraine, have him appointed here at this very important moment. So it's great to be here with Jeff, and congratulations to Greece for getting such a terrific diplomat. In Jeff's remarks, he talked about the diaspora. I'm a member of the diaspora. When he said it's hard to say sometimes if the diaspora is speaking for Greeks, for Americans, Greek Americans, or Greek Americans from New Jersey. I'm a Greek American from New Jersey, but today I'm speaking on behalf of the University of Virginia and the Miller Center. We are the leading place in the country, as Tom was mentioning, on studying the presidency and presidential history. We have done the official oral history for every president since Jimmy Carter, which means we work with the presidential libraries to interview the senior-most 100 or so officials of the White House and the cabinet agencies. We also have been deeply studying, transcribing, and analyzing the secret Oval Office recordings of the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administration. As far as we know, there have not been secret Oval Office recordings since, but you never know. So the work that I'm going to talk about for just 7 or 8 minutes here is an overview of our findings about presidential first years. We understand that there's a lot of concern and anxiety around the world with any new administration, particularly one that is self-described as unconventional, wanting to shake things up and change things, disruptive, deconstructing the administrative state. But there is a pattern to presidential first years, and as putting back up there, President Trump has said that he wants to do things differently, and nothing really has prepared him for what he is taking on right now, and that would be the case if it was Hillary Clinton. He is now in charge of 4 million employees, the largest company in the world. It's actually bigger than the national government of China, or China, as the president likes to say. And that's 1.5 million in uniform and 2.5 million civilian employees. And even when George H.W. Bush took it over from Ronald Reagan, it was thought of as the time as a hostile takeover. So that is always the case. And remember, to manage those 4 million employees, at best, there are 4,000 political appointees. So it's a very small ratio of people that get appointed to the number of people that work for them. And every administration struggles with that transfer, and we break that struggle down into 5 component parts. We call them P's because it's the presidency and it's the power of the presidency. And I'll go quickly through each of these 5, and then we can have a conversation, and I'm eager to hear Nick, because Concordia really specializes in working with presidents from across the world and around the world. And I think it's a terrific partnering to be up here with Nick to talk about how they're doing so far. What does presidential history teach us about personnel? Well, the first thing is every administration screws up. So this is Al Haig, who was President Reagan's first Secretary of State. This is day 69 of the Reagan administration. President Reagan at this moment had just arrived at George Washington Hospital. He had been shot. And Al Haig goes to the podium in the press room and says, "At this moment, I am in command here at the White House." And of course, that was not the case, because the Constitution says that the Secretary of State is 4th in line, the Vice President is 1st in line. Vice President George H.W. Bush was in a helicopter, which is usually known as Marine 1 when the Vice President's in it's Marine 2. And it was on its way to the White House, and he explicitly said, "Don't land on the South Lawn, land on the Mall," because if it was the South Lawn, that's what the president does. And because Al Haig misunderstood the moment, he lasted about a year. So the Trump administration is already working through its personnel issues, and we can talk about where they stand, but it is not unusual to misfire in your first year, even with people like Al Haig, who had been White House Chief of Staff and a 4-star general. I happened to work in the Clinton administration, and the model for success, in my view, was Sandy Berger. He was the national security advisor I worked for at the White House. And Sandy's motto was, be heard but not seen. Be behind the president, be the last person to speak, and be an honest broker to the other cabinet agencies. And I think in the Mike Flynn undoing, I think we saw the exact opposite of that, and I think President Trump is learning that he needs to have staff who are staff to him and staff to the cabinet secretaries. What that revolves around is process. You need to establish clear processes in the federal government. This is probably the best cabinet ever assembled by a president. The president himself had already been vice president for 8 years, ambassador to China, ambassador to the United Nations, ambassador, head of the CIA. His Secretary of State, James Baker, had already been Secretary of the Treasury, White House Chief of Staff. His Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, had already been White House Chief of Staff and a senior member of Congress. Brent Scowcroft, the National Security Advisor, had already been National Security Advisor, and a few other no-names like Colin Powell and Bob Gates and John Sununu in the room. Not to mention his vice president, who had already been a senator and knew the Senate. Yet as Vice President Cheney told us, later Vice President, then Defense Secretary Cheney told us in his oral history with us, when presented with our first crisis, a failed coup in Panama, we totally screwed it up. The Secretary of Defense said one thing, the Secretary of State said another thing, and the White House was sending a different communication to Panama. But they did a quick after-action report, and they realized that they needed to have their deputies talking to one another on a daily basis, something that is now known as the deputies process. That was established in the days and weeks after the failed coup in Panama in October of 1989. And 1 month later, this happened, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And it's a good thing that they had had that failure in Panama, because they learned from that failure, and it's probably still the most significant diplomatic success since the Marshall Plan, the peaceful reunification of Europe. And it happened because they learned a lesson that they shouldn't speak publicly before they established a clear process, came up with a single set of talking points, and then communicated that first privately to allies in Europe, and then to, at the time, a potential adversary in the Soviet Union. And by the way, they'd spent 9 months trying to figure out what the policy would be toward Gorbachev, and that review came up with, he is for real, Glasnost is a real thing, we should go with this. After personnel and process, you start establishing your priorities, and I think most administrations, as Ambassador Pyatt said, end up learning that they need to come back to some basics. And the basics that the administration will focus on and that you should all pay attention to is actually not European affairs. Remember, that'll be a third or fourth priority. The first priority is, it's the economy, stupid. Now, we all know the gentleman on the left of that photo, George Stephanopoulos, another member of the diaspora, and Jim Carville with him. Remember, it's the economy, stupid was the thing that got President Clinton elected. And as soon as he got elected, he forgot about it. And he started talking about gays in the military. And he spent 9 months trying to unwind what was a very worthy cause, and he ended up being on the exact opposite place of where he wanted to be, because he didn't understand the politics. He had not prepared the ground for it. And frankly, it was not his elected priority. His elected priority was turning the economy around, and he came back around to that in the fall and went back against his campaign pledge to run against NAFTA and renegotiated the NAFTA agreement, and did it in a bipartisan way. Presidents learn to be bipartisan. It's what they end up doing. One president that mastered that well and stayed focused on the thing that got him elected in a bipartisan way was George W. Bush. This is 9/11. I think we all know this moment when Andy Card, the chief of staff, said, "A second plane has hit a second tower, America's under attack." But what people forget about this is that they were in a schoolroom in Florida. President Bush was elected as the compassionate conservative that was going to redo education reform in a way that brought liberals and conservatives together. And in his first days in office, he started working on that. He invited Ted Kennedy to the White House for a special viewing of the movie 13 Days, which was about how President Kennedy had solved the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he started at that moment working with Ted Kennedy, and it took him 1 year to negotiate No Child Left Behind, where conservatives got what they wanted, accountability in American schools, and liberals got what they wanted, more funding for federal education. That goes to politics. We now have an outsider president whose party controls both houses of Congress. That appears to be a recipe for success. It can also be a recipe for failure. Jimmy Carter was an outsider president who, in his day, he didn't use these words, but was going to clean up the swamp, drain the swamp of Washington corruption, of Watergate. He had both houses of Congress led by Tip O'Neill in the House, and they got one thing done essentially in their first year. They created the Department of Energy, but a lot of the rest of his legislative agenda, tax reform, infrastructure reform, many of the same issues that come back and are on President Trump's agenda Didn't happen in that first year because he never mastered Congress, as he told us in his oral history. I was elected without the Congress. I thought I could do things without them, and it took me a year to learn that. And at that point, the time window was open because, as Lyndon Johnson said, after your first year, Congress thinks about their own reelection. They don't care about you anymore. And that line comes from Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson, in his first year after Kennedy's assassination, passed the Civil Rights Act. And then in his first year with big majorities, whoops, I didn't, there's another slide coming up. In his first year, he didn't, after the 64 elections in 65, he passed immigration reform, Medicare and Medicaid, the Voting Rights Act, and education reform. Finally, how you conduct yourself as a person is very important. The president I worked for, who we like to tease a lot, was the subject of Saturday Night Live ridicule. I don't know how much people here in Greece follow the show. It's a weekly obsession now in the United States to see how they're going to skewer Donald Trump, and they were skewering Bill Clinton. Notice in the picture on the left, this is a branding expert's nightmare. He has a hat that says one thing, a shirt that says something else, and he's carrying McDonald's cups, two of them. One's Coke and one's coffee. And they saw it immediately on Saturday Night Live, and they went for it. He's wearing a Georgetown hat and an Arkansas sweatshirt. I can tell you that I never wear my Yale hat at the University of Virginia, and if I did, they would be all over me. Ronald Reagan is the model for how presidents carry themselves. He projected not just what kind of president he wanted to be, but the kind of president that he thought most Americans wanted. And that goes back to Thomas Jefferson. I'm from the University of Virginia. We can't do a talk without referencing Thomas Jefferson. This was his dining room table at Monticello, which had no head nor foot at it. It was bringing people around a common table, and I think President Trump will learn that art. Every president has to. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Nick and to Tom.